So it was my senior year of college. Some friends and I went out hiking, and we got lost. We ended up falling about 100 feet down this rock face, and then rolled about another 50 yards down a bunch of loose rock on a scree hill. It was 45 minutes after the fall before anybody showed up, and the first people on the scene were some friends. And it was about another 45 minutes before a wilderness first responder came. About another 45 minutes after that, all the emergency personnel came. And so there were fire trucks and there were lights. There's a helicopter circling above. But in the end, they put me on a stretcher. They carried me down the mountain, put me in an ambulance, and off I went to the hospital. I don't remember much of it. Went into a coma the next day. I had lost about a third of the blood that was in my body. I had also, in the end, shattered my pelvis. I had broken my femur, which is the strongest bone in our bodies. I'd broken the head right off of it. I had quartered my kneecap. I had cut up my body, my arms, cuts all over my face, and also broken my neck. It's a miracle I'm alive. So the doctor sent me home with 2 bottles of pain medication. One was every 4 hours, as often as I wanted, basically. And the other one was every night. It was like a 12-hour pill. And they sent me home with those to help me make it through it so my body could rest and recover. And I'm really thankful to have had that. It was a difficult time in my life, and having that helped me get through. So as a society, we've agreed that there are certain times when it is okay to use drugs. When a doctor prescribes an opioid to a patient who's in pain, we've said that that's okay, and it's under the medical supervision, then we let that be. The Bible even talks about this. In the book of Proverbs, it says, "Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter." What that does is it offers some situations when it's okay. I think as a society, we do a disservice to each other if we moralize drugs and say they're always wrong all the time under every condition. Even the book of Proverbs allows for some situational understanding of when it's okay and when it's not okay. So there's a time and a place for everything. The book of Ecclesiastes talks about this. It says that there's a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to plant and a time to harvest. I think we might be able to make the same argument about drugs. There's a time to use drugs and a time to avoid using drugs. We need wisdom to be able to know which is which. We need to make good decisions and make choices that demonstrate that we have that wisdom. So adolescence is a big time of change, but it's also this time of biological change. And one of the things that we don't know as a research community is just how much of an impact it has when we ingest substances during this biological shifting period. Now, there are some things we do know, and I want to cover some of those to help factor into this decision-making process. One of the things we know is that the earlier someone starts using substances, so a 13-year-old, we'll say, starts drinking alcohol, the more problems they have later on in life. The less likely they are to graduate from high school or to go to college, the less likely they are to earn money over their lifespan, the more likely they are to be addicted to a substance later on in life, the more likely they are to be admitted to like a treatment facility and have to go into a hospital to detox substances or are prone to alcoholism. So we know that beginning using substances early can actually change the trajectories of life later on. So one of the ways that this has been studied is to use rat models. Rats grow at a pretty fast rate, but their adolescent period is about 2 weeks instead of 10 years. And so one of the things that's been done to test this is to understand, well, what exactly is the effect of using alcohol early on in adolescence? And so they had 2 cages with rats in them, and they would give one side, they gave alcohol every day for 2 weeks, just a little drop of alcohol. And then at the end of 2 weeks, what they did is they put up electric shocks on the way to the cocaine at the end of the cage. And the rats that hadn't been primed with alcohol went toward the cocaine to get the drug, the substance, but the shocks and the punishment of that electric shock prevented them from going. For the rats that had been primed with alcohol, they were interested enough in obtaining that cocaine that they went through the shocks, even though it hurt a whole lot, to get to the cocaine. One of the hypotheses that we deal with in the drug prevention field is this idea of a gateway drug, that alcohol and cigarettes will lead to other kinds of drug use later on. And this rat model supports that hypothesis. If kids start engaging in substance use early, it is priming them for wanting to pursue that high later on. And this is an important thing to understand. There are periods of development in a person's life that are critical periods of development. So in the biological literature, we talk about myelinization, which is when the neurological system in the body puts little fatty cells around it called myelin to make it more efficient in its decision making and its ability to process information quickly. Our brains are amazingly fascinating, and they process information in microseconds. So these periods of myelinization are times when our bodies are preparing to make decisions quickly and preparing us to deal with social realities as they come. Let me give you an example. Has anyone ever tried to learn a language after they were about 5 years old? It's a lot harder because our bodies, the way our brains are structured before 5, is that we just soak up information from all channels all the time in every direction. And so the gray matter in our brains just multiplies very rapidly over the first 5 years of life because we're sucking up so many new ideas and new information. But what happens about 5 years old is the brain starts to try and become more efficient and to routinize the paths that are most used. And so it's harder to learn new information, but we're a lot faster to recall the information that we already know. Myelinization happens again later in childhood. It also happens in adolescence, and it also happens again about 22 years old. It's like the final period of massive myelinization in the body. So what happens when we ingest substances at that critical time period? In some ways, we aren't sure, but looking at the evidence, we know that it's changing the trajectories of people as they develop. That's a really important consideration. So in our culture, we're changing the legal landscape of where drugs can be used. Some states are debating whether or not it should be legal to recreationally use marijuana. A lot of states have already legalized it for medical use. That changing and shifting landscape will probably continue to change and shift. But the question is not whether it's legal, the question is whether or not it's wise. If we can make wise choices, then we can navigate these shifting landscapes with more power and clarity. So in the book of Corinthians, it talks about the Corinthian people were writing to Paul, and they said, "It's permissible for me to do everything." And Paul writes back and says, "But it's not beneficial." They say, "It's permissible for me to do everything." And Paul writes and says, "But I won't be mastered by anything." So the question is not whether or not you can use cigarettes at 18, alcohol at 21, marijuana depending on your state, or if you travel across the border and it's 18 is the legal drinking age in Mexico that you can drink there. That's not the question. The legality of it is just a bottom line, like a fail-safe that society has established around this behavior. But we have the opportunity to live beyond that fail-safe. We have the opportunity to make wise choices that position us to be leaders in society, not just followers. That position us to make wise choices about when to use strong drink, when to use drugs, and when not to. So I want you to take a minute and think about this. Is there anything in your life that could be mastering you? It doesn't have to be drugs, it could be anything. Surveys that were done with over 45,000 kids across the nation, it's a representative sample, showed that about 20% of youth in 8th grade had ever tried alcohol. That number increased to about 50% in 12th grade that have ever tried alcohol. Now there's an interesting caveat. Our perceptions of those numbers change whether we're using alcohol or not using alcohol. So if we ask an 8th grader who had tried alcohol, how many people do you think have used alcohol? They'll estimate about 50%. If you ask a 12th grader who tried alcohol, how many people do you think are using alcohol, they'd say about 100%. And so the perceptions of the prevalence are inflated for those who engage in a certain behavior. But they're more accurate if you don't engage in those behaviors. So an 8th grader who hadn't used alcohol will estimate pretty accurately about 20% of 8th graders had tried alcohol. And the same for 12th grade, they'll estimate about 50%. So their numbers are a lot more accurate. So we see this perceptual shift that occurs when an adolescent engages in the behavior. They start to assume other people are like them and more people are engaged in the behavior than actually is true. This has a profound influence on some adolescents because the norms or what they expect of the groups around them will influence their behavior. And so it's important to recognize that perception shifts depending on the usage. Using drugs is not an absolute moral wrong all the time, right? We were talking about that before. But instead it's a choice that has consequences. And there's positive consequences and there's negative consequences. And we really have to think through what are the social, legal, and health consequences that are related to this kind of substance use. Let's start with some of the positive consequences. There could be some good things that happen if you engage in a certain behavior. If you drink alcohol, you might fit in better with a group that's drinking alcohol. They might look at you and say, you're one of us. You might gain a sense of belonging by engaging in the behavior that the people around you are engaging in. You also might start to feel good. The drugs produce a high, and that's the reason that people use them, partly is because they do something physiologically to our bodies. But those positive consequences, social and biological, have to be balanced. And so I want to also talk about some of the other consequences that might come out. So let's talk about some of the negative social consequences. One of the things that happens is what you think might be a positive social consequence, like impressing somebody else by engaging in the behavior, might actually be a negative consequence. You see, there's this fundamental attribution error, is what we call it, where we tend to assume good things about ourselves and bad things about other people. If we engage in behavior, we recognize it's because of the good things that we are and what we do. If we engage in some bad behavior, we blame it on the context around us. It's the bad circumstances. If somebody else engages in a good behavior, we say, oh, it's not just them, it's because of all the life that happened around them that set them up for that good thing. And so when you engage in behavior to try and fit in or to impress somebody, instead of thinking good things about you, they may start attributing that behavior to something else around you. So what you actually think is a positive social consequence that somebody else might read as a negative social consequence. And we need to understand that people perceive things differently than we do. And so positives may be negatives and negatives may turn out to be positives too. And we need to balance that understanding when we're making our decision. As alcohol enters into the body, one of the things that it does is it lowers inhibitions. So inhibitions are the part of the brain that helps us think through all of our decisions and to think forward and future-oriented. And so when those inhibitions are lowered, it causes us to make decisions that may be focused only on what's proximal and immediately in front of us. And so that process of losing inhibitions can lead people into decisions that they wouldn't have made if it hadn't been for the alcohol or the influence of the drugs. This might be decisions about relationships. It might be decisions about risky behavior, like jumping off the roof into a swimming pool or something like that. It's just not necessarily a good decision and can have long-term ramifications that play out in somebody's life. Some of the negative consequences of using cigarettes are that it can turn your teeth yellow and it might be hard to get a date. Or some people say that if they smoke, then their parents will be able to smell on their clothes the smell of the cigarettes, and they'll get in a lot of trouble. Sometimes people say, then I'll just use e-cigarettes. Vaping smells good. But one of the problems with that is there's actually more addictive substance in the chemicals that are used for vaping than in a cigarette. So people who vape get addicted to the behavior and engage in it even more frequently, more times throughout the day, than just a smoking behavior. And they actually consume more of the drug than they would if they were just smoking cigarettes. So it's a catch-22 where the health consequences are a lot worse for vaping, even if some of the social consequences are a little bit more acceptable. And those have to be balanced when making this decision. One aspect of development that needs to be considered is earlier use can predict later consequences. And for every year that we delay the onset of alcohol use, we push back those consequences. So if someone doesn't start drinking until they're 21, from a public health standpoint, the research community doesn't really worry about that person because the consequences of their actions if they don't start drinking until 21 are so much lower. So we've been talking about risks about populations in general, but it's also important to consider the individual risk. Drinking alcohol factors into a whole set of individual issues as well. Think about it like this. If you go to a doctor's office, you're asked to fill out a medical history form. In that form, they'll ask, well, has your father had any high cholesterol or a heart attack? How about your grandfather? And the doctors take that medical history because it predisposes you toward those conditions. Well, the same thing happens with drug use. If your family has alcoholism somewhere in its lineage, then it may put you particularly at a higher risk for alcoholism. So if someone who's primed for alcoholism takes a drink of alcohol, they may become addicted a whole lot more quickly, even after one time of drinking, than someone who has never had alcohol or doesn't have a family history of alcoholism. So that's a risk that is an individual risk that also has to be factored into these kind of broader social considerations and aggregate understanding of adolescence. Another thing to think about risk is inhalants. Sometimes taking one puff, like one inhale of an inhalant, can stop functioning of the brain. It can kill you after one time. If heroin's been laced with other kinds of substances to make it go farther, so it's a more bang for the buck for the dealers, then using that bad drug can kill you after just one instance. And you can overdose, but not because of the drug amount, but because of the other chemicals that have been put with it to package it. These are really important risks to consider. Even after one use, there can be massive health consequences, even death. There are also legal consequences. I had a friend who was caught using prescription drugs. What had happened is he started using them to feel good and then got addicted to them and started using his business and his profession in illegal ways to be able to fund that purchase of those prescription drugs, and he got caught. He was a married man, he was advanced in his career, he had 2 children, and he was separated from them. He went to jail and served his time, and while he was in jail, he was not actually able to communicate with his family. He had to earn the right to do that. His wife ended up divorcing him. So he got out, but he was starting at ground zero. He had to take on minimum wage jobs in order to rebuild his credibility in his profession, and he had to actually take a new licensure exam to be certified again to participate. He also had to slowly build relationship with his children, but he lost so much. And it happened because he was focused on the positive consequences, and that became like tunnel vision on that one thing that he was after without considering all the other consequences that were around him. These also have to be considered when making a decision about whether or not to use alcohol or drugs. Do the pros outweigh the cons? I want you to take 1 minute and turn to somebody next to you, and I want you to think about the consequences, the positive, the negative, the social, the legal, the medical, all of them, and answer this question: when do the positive consequences outweigh the negative consequences? We've talked about the situations where it may be appropriate and inappropriate to use drugs, and that all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial, that we won't be mastered by anything. And then we transitioned and we talked a little bit more about drugs as a choice with consequences, and there may be positive and negative social, legal, medical, health consequences to drug use decisions. And you have to make a decision about which choices you want to make and which consequences you're willing to accept. So how do you make a good decision? There's good models out there that help you think about defining what the problem is, what the choice is, right? And then the next step is thinking about and brainstorming, well, what are the pros and the cons? What are the consequences in different domains of this decision? If I do it, what good will come of it? What bad will come of it? If I don't do it, what am I going to miss out on? What bad will come of it? And what good will come of it if I don't do it? And thinking about that decision and analyzing that decision is a really important mental step that everyone needs to take when you're faced with a decision that's going to have consequences. Using drugs is one of those kinds of decisions. And you might need to go through this at different iterations or different times as you progress through your life. So define the problem, analyze the consequences of that problem, and then do it. Make a decision and try it out. Now the last step is to look back on your decision and evaluate. Did that go like I wanted it to? Did I get out of it what I had hoped to? Was I able to mitigate the problems or avoid the risks? Was the decision a good decision? And that evaluation phase then plays into the next time you have to make a decision. And so the whole process gets to repeat itself. But this kind of decision making is a thoughtful way to make the choices that you need to make with your intimate understanding of the social situations that you're moving into. So if you're in a situation that you don't want to be in, then what strategies can you use to navigate that situation? So that's a question that we've been asking for about 30 years in research, and we've been talking to a lot of adolescents around the country to find out what they already do when they get into a situation that they don't want to be in. And what we've distilled from that are 4 strategies: refuse, explain, avoid, and leave. A refusal is simply saying no, saying I don't want that, no thanks. Explain is offering a reason for why you're saying no. And sometimes people would appreciate that. So maybe sometimes people at first refuse, but if they're offered again, then they'll add an explanation. Explanations can be things like, no, I've got to study for a test. No, my parents would smell the smoke on my clothes, or they'd smell the fragrance from the vaping on my clothes. I can't because I'm going to be driving tonight. Those kinds of excuses have some cachet, they have some social clout, and when you use those excuses, your friends or whoever's offering you the substance typically will say, okay, I understand that, I've been in that kind of situation too, and they'll leave you alone, and that you can navigate that situation without affecting the relationship that you have with that person. The third strategy is an avoid strategy. It can be a proactive strategy where if you expect drug offers to happen in a certain place, you just don't go there. You can also avoid, if you get into a situation, you can redirect conversation. So say somebody's offering you a substance, you can just ignore that offer and change the subject. Say, well, did you watch the basketball game that the school played in yesterday? Or talk about something else, right? Are you ready for the test that we're going to have next week? Right? Those kinds of conversational turns can help avoid that offer as well. You can also avoid by going into a different room if you wanted to, and just steering clear of the part of the house where the behavior that's happening that you don't want to be part of is going on. The last strategy is a leave strategy. This is kind of a final say, I'm getting out of here, and then leaving the situation. If you don't want to be in a place, if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you have a sense that things aren't right, then that's a great strategy to get out of a situation that you don't want to be in. You need to have an exit plan to get out of that situation. So this can be a phone call that you make to a parent, an older sibling, maybe a youth group leader, maybe a teacher, just someone that you trust that cares about you, that would be able to come and get you if you needed them. And you may be able to set this up before you go to a specific situation, or it may just be a general person that you can always call no matter what, no questions asked, to get out of a situation. Sometimes you might want to develop a code word with that person, or a phrase that if you say that word or you write that phrase in a text, then they'll drop whatever they're doing and come and get you right then. Because doing that and having an exit plan before you go into situations, preparing a little bit, allows you to get out of situations that you don't want to be in. Refuse, explain, avoid, and leave are strategies that you can use in combination, sometimes mixing them together, to navigate the situations and make and communicate the choices that you want to make. When you make a decision and you've decided to do something, you have to communicate that decision to other people. Communication typically is going to happen in 3 different ways. You could be passive about something, you could be assertive about something, Or you could be aggressive about something. When you share your decision, we advocate that you be assertive. So that's being confident in your decision, not compromising on what you believe, but being respectful to other people. Being passive is compromising your position and not making the decision that you would normally make, but instead letting other people influence you in ways that you don't want to be influenced. Being aggressive is holding to your decision but bullying other people into your decision or not being respectful. So the middle of the road approach is to be confident, to maintain your decision, and then to be respectful of other people as well. Now, how do we communicate assertively? We do it with our heads up, our strong voice, we make eye contact, we communicate that decision through our nonverbals as well as the way that we communicate verbally. A passive person will oftentimes lower their eyes, drop their head, they won't make eye contact, they sometimes talk in a softer voice, and then they'll compromise their decision. An aggressive person will speak forcefully, they'll lean forward, sometimes they'll clench their teeth. It's an angry position, right? And so the way that we communicate that decision matters too. And so again, we're advocating not to be passive, not to be aggressive, but to be assertive, confident in your decision and respectful toward others. So adolescence has a bad rap because as kids go through adolescence, there's this myth that parents and adolescents have horrible relationships and that there's this rebellious teenager model. But in fact, the research shows about 70%, that's the vast majority of kids as they go through adolescence, tend to maintain a good relationship with their parents. There's more conflict that happens during that time, and adolescents tend to look more to their peers for some decisions, but parents maintain a strong voice and influence in their kids' lives, especially over this issue of drugs. Mothers are the ones that kids have most gone to ask about drug use, and kids see their parents as a trusted source of information. I would encourage you, go talk to your parents about this issue. Try asking them this question: what are our family rules about drug use? And then you might also ask, where did those family rules come from? What's our family story that led to these rules? One of the things to understand is most parents want good things for their kids. They make rules as best they know how to help you flourish. And I think it makes a lot of sense to try and make that work together, to initiate a dialogue or to maintain a dialogue and make it even better. Talking about drugs helps make good decisions about drugs, and you'll learn some of the family history that leads into those decisions. Ultimately, the decision is yours, and you face the consequences. They're on your shoulders. They'll affect your relationships with your parents, with your friends, with God, in your career. The ramifications are broad, but you also have the skills that you need to make decisions. We've talked about how to communicate those decisions, how to get out of situations that you don't want to be in, what strategies you can use. Ultimately, the decisions are yours, but you have what you need to make decisions that will affect your life in a positive way.